When you hear the word sacrifice, what comes to mind? Perhaps because you are in church, what comes to mind is the system of sacrifices in the temple or the atoning sacrifice of Christ on the cross. After all, this is what our readings all reference today. Malachi talks about presenting offerings in righteousness. And in Hebrews, we hear all about this sacrifice of atonement. Our gospel story tells us that Mary and Joseph bring Jesus, their firstborn son, to be presented at the temple and to make the required sacrifices. This is the whole reason that Mary and Joseph have traveled to Jerusalem, to fulfill their obligation to offer a sacrifice to God. And the scene we should be imagining here is not a subdued or quiet place of contemplation, but rather a full and bustling courtyard with animals bleating and cooing, fire and smoke, and a cacophony of prayers surrounding you. But what are all these sacrifices about? I think it is unsurprising that for us looking back on this practice, there is, if we are honest with ourselves, something baffling about it. Now, we in the modern world talk about sacrifice too, of course. Outside of a church context, what tends to come to mind when we talk about sacrifice is partners sacrificing certain ambitions for the sake of the family, or soldiers making sacrifices, risking their very lives in service to their country. And while these kinds of sacrifices have a certain resonance with the ancient sacrifices of the temple, there is something lost in translation. Because all of the sacrifices of this modern sort are really about loss. To sacrifice something in the modern mind is to suffer a loss. A cost is being paid, albeit for something altruistic, but in the end, we still count it as a loss. But ancient sacrifices were not necessarily considered losses. Sacrifices would be made for all sorts of reasons. In thanksgiving, to atone for a sin, like in Hebrews, to mark key moments in life, such as the birth of a firstborn, as we see in today's gospel, and just as occasions for feasts and festivals. The meat of the animal sacrifice would often become the main dish for the feast that followed, if it wasn't being used to feed the priests who were not allowed to own their own land and animals. But a sacrifice for the ancient Hebrews, more than being something merely suffered, is really more akin to what we would call a gift. And so what is given up in this ancient context isn't really experienced as a loss, but rather the price any giver pays to bestow a gift. The bringing of an animal from your herd to be sacrificed at the temple, or more commonly, to buy an animal at the temple for the sake of convenience, was all about bringing a gift to God. A gift given in recognition of the relationship that you share with one another. And for an agrarian society that measured wealth in terms of the size of the herd, it was the gifting of an animal, a gifting of your very livelihood that made the most sense to them. And while we don't bring animals to the temple or to church to be sacrificed, this kind of ancient sacrifice is still central to our worship of God. The Eucharist, which is really just the Greek word for thanksgiving, is all about our making a thanksgiving offering, a gift, a sacrifice to God in thanksgiving for the special relationship that we have with God through Christ. As Rite One puts it, we offer ourselves, our souls and bodies. We offer praise and thanksgiving. We offer bread and wine, bread being our most basic means of sustenance, and wine being a symbol of celebration. And we offer our money, just as those ancient Hebrews offered their animals. And when we come into this place and offer up all of those things to God, when we process our very own resources right up here to the altar, it is not a loss that we experience in the way most modern sacrifices are seen as a loss, but rather God takes up all of those offerings, joins them to Jesus' offering, his offering of himself, and then offers them back to us in a form even greater than the sum of its parts. What starts as a little bread, a sip of wine, a small portion of our wealth, blessed and transformed into the very presence of Jesus Christ among us. What we offer is given back to us. The great spiritual writer Evelyn Underhill once wrote, "For the fully Christian life is a Eucharistic life. That is, a natural life conformed to the pattern of Jesus, given in its wholeness to God, laid on his altar as a sacrifice of love, and consecrated, transformed by his inpouring life to be used to give life and food to other souls." This is our sacrifice. It is the sacrifice we come here each week to make. And it is the sacrifice we make throughout the week, our offering to family and coworkers, friends and neighbors, a giving of life and food to other souls. Now, Simeon announces to Mary the sword that will pierce her soul, the sacrifice that she will make to give life and food to other souls as the mother of the Messiah. But in the end, that sacrifice of hers turns out to be no loss at all. It is merely the price paid in offering a gift. And out of that wound pours the very means of eternal life. Life and food for other souls, indeed. This is what we mean when we as Christians talk about the sacrifice of soul and body, of praise and thanksgiving. It is the life of the Eucharist. So I ask you again, when you hear the word sacrifice, what comes to mind for you? What have you been called on to offer up as a gift? Will you pay that price?